Perfect. We are recording. Daniel, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Thanks, Jordan. I'm doing great. Good to be here.
Good. And for context, on our last episode, this episode is actually inspired by our last one because of the feedback that we got from the episode with Sam from Cartwrights. And it's especially resonated with people in TradFi. It was getting passed around. People were contact me and saying that, oh, I've just passed this to my financial advisor. I've passed this to someone who's very skeptical. And that's why I make these podcasts, is for people to use as a tool. And one of the key themes that came back, though, from this was the reluctance to take a position in Bitcoin because of the environmental side of things and the narrative. So I asked you to come on, and I'm very grateful that you're here. So for anyone that doesn't know, could you share a little bit about your background and what you do?
Sure. My background is I'm a impact investor and more recently a climate tech investor. So I've launched 2 funds. We're currently launching a 3rd one in the area of methane mitigation. And a little while ago, some people said to me, you should look at Bitcoin as a potential element of a climate tech fund. And I said, Bitcoin, that's terrible for the environment. What are you talking about? But they encouraged me to look into it more deeply, and I was very happy that I did. And I did some due diligence on it. And I came to the conclusion that, yes, actually, Bitcoin mining does have positive environmental externalities, but it was not apparent at first glance. So these days, I not only embrace Bitcoin as a form of valid climate technology, but I help other investors and the general population understand some of the non-obvious benefits of Bitcoin as an ESG asset.
Awesome. And before we dive headfirst into Bitcoin, I actually recently watched a brilliant talk that you done. I will link to it below. And one of the sections was about disruptive technology and using this as a starting point before going into Bitcoin. So that's how I think we're going to frame this episode. So why would you start with disruptive technology before going into Bitcoin?
It's really important to understand that Bitcoin is a disruptive technology. And as such, we need to understand the cycle that it goes through, both its adoption curve, but also its information curve. And one of the things, so I was a technology entrepreneur before I started my first technology investment company. And we discovered the hard way that if you have a disruptive technology, then the incumbents who enjoy an entrenched position, they will protect that entrenched position using all the means at their disposal, and they have a big outreach. And if we look through history, this has happened for every disruptive technology in an unbroken stream of 160 years since the telegraph. And we can chart very accurately how the media and how the general public and how even reputable experts responded in the early years to technologies such as the telegraph, such as the bicycle even, such as the automobile, such as the radio. And what we see is some stark parallels to Bitcoin, in that generally what happens for the first 10 to 15 years is there's this wave of responses through the media, which are generally negative, because this, for 2 reasons. Number one, this technology is disrupting other industries. But number 2, it's just not very well understood. And there's a psychological tendency when humans don't understand anything new particularly well, we tend to gravitate towards the negative interpretations. And there's some very strong evolutionary reasons. If you talk to an evolutionary biologist, they'll tell you why that was important for evolution, that if you're in a new environment and some data is unclear, you should assume in the negative because that ensures the survival of the species. So we tend to respond in very similar ways in the presence of something unclear. And then what tends to happen is over time, we get better research. People understand the technologies more. Some of those early misunderstandings are debunked, and a truer, more nuanced picture and a truer, more nuanced appraisal of a technology starts to happen. We saw that with, again, every technology from the telegraph, the bicycle, the radio, the internet, and Bitcoin simply a continuation of that trend.
And you've been one of the people at the forefront, especially that I've seen anyway, of fighting back against the misinformation that, as you say, that it's just people not understanding what this is. But it comes across in the media. People trust the media, and they will take the word for it. And you've been one of the ones that's been rebutting this over the years, and fantastically, I must add. Can you share a little bit about what why you've been doing that and why you think that's important? Because it seemed to me, whenever a news article came out which was either factually incorrect or misinformation, you were the first one on the scene.
Because I made the same mistake initially myself. So I have empathy for people who are presenting narratives about Bitcoin, such as, for example, the most common one is Bitcoin uses too much energy, it's bad for the environment. And when I started to look at it in a more nuanced way, I realized that that wasn't in fact true. There's a deeper truth to that. And that is that a technology can use a lot of energy. And you can say, well, that means it's bad for the environment. It's a little bit like saying, well, you eat too much food, therefore that's bad for the body. And it actually depends on the sort of food that you're eating. If you're eating too much chocolate cake and fat, greasy food full of seed oils, then that's probably true, particularly if you're having a lot of sugary, fizzy drinks at the same time. If you're consuming a large volume of tropical fruits and fresh green salads, then that's probably false, and that more consumption is probably aiding your health. So the first thing is we need to look at the form of energy that is being consumed. And because the reality is a lot of people, both in the general population and in investment committees and also in the media, do not necessarily understand, as I didn't either, the nuances of energy, how it's consumed, how electricity grids work. We tend to miss out some of these nuances and have a visceral reaction against a technology because it uses so much energy, and that seems intuitively obscene. The other issue is that there's a tendency, and this was my first tendency, to regard that as wasteful, because that technology doesn't, at first glance, appear to be doing something useful other than being a different asset class or a speculative asset class. And again, it's only on deeper investigation you find that just because you do not understand, as I didn't, the utility of a technology doesn't mean it doesn't have utility. So we have a duty in doing due diligence to understand what the merits of a new technology are. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin is, and this is one of the reasons that many people in the West miss the benefits of it, is that most of the benefits of Bitcoin apply to nations which, number one, do not enjoy good banking rails. Number two, are autocratic regimes where the possibility of being financially censored or having the financial system weaponized against you for saying the wrong thing or engaging in the wrong protest are high. It tends to be more useful in those societies. And thirdly, societies who have high inflation or even hyperinflation, which right now is 250 billion people who are experiencing that, where Bitcoin can be a store of value against the erosion of intergenerational wealth or even your family's wealth. Now, there are tremendous advantages within the West as well. However, I would be the first to say that the most pronounced advantages, and there's around 19 of them which have been quantified so far, is in those types of countries. People who don't have good banking rails, that's around 1.9 billion people worldwide who that describes, people who live in environments of hyperinflation, that's 250 billion people, or people who live in autocratic or semi-autocratic regimes, that's around 4.8 billion people. So these are not small communities, but they're ones that we don't often see firsthand, and because we have certain privileges living in the West, we don't often understand just how important Bitcoin can be in some of those societies.
Yeah, and we're in the West, living in the West, myself anyway, a big aspect of it, and I know you've got a newsletter around this, especially for institutions is the ESG angle, and their ESG mandate. So for a lot of people, might not know what ESG means. So firstly, could you just break down what that means quickly?
Literally, it's environment, social governance. So it's looking at three aspects of an investment that must be considered alongside, does it produce a return? And there's been numerous different incarnations of this. Prior to ESG, we used to talk about triple bottom line accounting, people, profit, and planet. So the acronym has changed, the terminology has changed, but the principle remains the same, which is to invest ethically or to invest with an idea of impact. We need to consider not just the financial returns, but the returns to society and to the environment as well.
And so you've turned your attention to sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. Why are you focusing here? I find this really interesting. I've saw you talk about it quite a few times, but for the audience, this is very interesting.
There's a couple of reasons. The first is I think we tend to gravitate towards seeking impact in the communities we're familiar with. So for me to seek a community of residential farmers, for example, probably someone who's a farmer would be more credible describing the benefit to rural farmers of Bitcoin. Similarly, if you're going to talk about the value of Bitcoin to firefighters, and there's a group who have recently, if you are a firefighter, you'll probably be taken more seriously because you speak the same language. So part of it is just simply having come from an investment background, having been used to the idea of due diligence, having been involved in impact investment for some years, I'm familiar with the lens that community of people look at the world from, as well as wanting a commercial return. The second reason is really that this, for me, represents the next wave of Bitcoin adoption. So if you look at Bitcoin in its adoption curve, so in the technology ecosystem, which I come from, we have this thing called crossing the chasm, which means that once you get past the early adopters, there can be a difficulty in then going from the early adopters to the early majority who adopted technology. And the reason for that is very simple. It's that the early adopters will tend to embrace a new technology because it's cool, because it's novel, because it's disruptive, because it does great things. It may not be fully usable to a broader population set, or it may be usable, but it has a few rough edges around it. But for the early adopters, they don't mind that because they'll dive in and they'll start using it. But for the early majority, they need to have some of those rough edges worn off in order to be users. And so some of the work, for example, that OnRamp's been doing to present a package. So here's a classic example. So to pension funds, until recently, it was a very promising technology and a very promising investment. But there was this issue about how do you custody the asset? And that problem hadn't been solved. And then OnRamp came along and they solved that problem by getting a multi-signatory corporate custody solution, which provided the combination of both security but without the counterparty risk. And then it became an asset which pension funds were able to use. So that was an innovation that's only come this year. Bitcoin's been around for 15 years. So part of that adoption cycle is that we start to find solutions that prevent a broader population embracing a technology. But the other part of it is communicating the value of that technology in ways that don't apply to the early adopters, but apply to the early majority. And the early majority care about different things. If you look at the people who cared about Bitcoin and who embraced Bitcoin to start with, they might say things like it's freedom money, or it's a chance to provide an alternative to the fiat state or to money printing, or the funding of wars, which you can do through credit. And we believe in those ideals of having a system where you don't have a money printer, where you can't devalue currency. Now, those are not the same concern set that a sovereign wealth fund will have, or that a pension fund will have. They'll have a very different concern set. So that'll be about more simple and immediate things which relate to their constituency of people who invest into those funds, such as what's its risk profile? What's its Sharpe ratio? If I put a 3% allocation into Bitcoin, will the returns of that fund be better or worse under different scenarios? Can we model that? And can we get an idea of risk versus return? And does it tick the ESG box? So there was a need for a different set of messaging that was relevant to that next community of potential adopters of Bitcoin. And because these are the ways that I myself got interested in Bitcoin, seeing that it had potential in these areas, it was natural for me to want to share that with others in that sector.
That makes sense. So you see, we've fixing the custody problem that we had for this next wave, and you see the next blocker, and I see this from other people as well, the next blocker as being the environmental narrative, we'll say, around Bitcoin.
Yeah, there's a few different ones, but the one that looms large, particularly in sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, is the perceived environmental merits of Bitcoin. It comes up, I was talking to Sam from Cartwright the other day, and he says, yes, this comes up about 2/3 of all pension funds. And it comes about as a result of what people have read in the media. And so even though what the media publish about Bitcoin has changed in the last 2 years remarkably, in fact, it's now net positive when it comes to reporting on Bitcoin, the reality is that that wasn't the case for a large number of years. From 2018 to 2022, there was a lot of negative coverage about Bitcoin and its supposed damage to the environment. And a lot of people have read those articles, and so those have formed a lot of impressions in people's minds. And so now that the science has changed on that, then it's a matter of updating and in some cases re-educating and talking people through, in the first instance, why the articles that they read were based on science which has now been debunked. And that kind of gets you to ground zero. But then that's not enough. All that says is why Bitcoin isn't as bad as you thought. That's not reason enough to tick an ESG box. So then the more exciting part is to say, well, look, now we have a reasonable understanding of why these articles came about and what the science now says. Let's now look at the more exciting part, which is the positive environmental externalities of Bitcoin.
So say the box gets ticked, the ESG box is ticked. What does this do for Bitcoin in terms of sovereign wealth funds, pension funds? How much have we got locked up there, and what's the result of being able to tick this box?
There are three different types of sovereign funds. There's sovereign wealth funds that hold the wealth of nation states. There's pension funds, and then there's central banks. If we exclude central banks for now, because one or two may invest in Bitcoin, but I don't think the large bulk of them are in the next couple of years. And if we just concentrate on sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, we're looking at $35 trillion of assets locked up in those two vehicles. If we then add on top of that ESG funds, then the figure goes beyond $60 trillion. So these are significant amounts of wealth that are held in those funds that until recently have not been able to allocate to Bitcoin.
So I was just writing a question down there because it popped up in my head whilst you were talking there. And do you think there's a problem being able to tick this box and release that amount of capital? Do you think that there's a problem in finding this research? Because if we take this down a level to individuals, it's very difficult for people coming in to find what is good literature, good articles, sifting through all of the noise. And I can imagine is it the same when you're moving up and going into institutions as well?
Yeah, until quite recently, this was absolutely a problem. What's happened in the last year, however, has been that people have got a lot better at cataloging the new information that's coming out. And also there's just been a real change, as I said, not only in the media reporting, but that media reporting has not just changed randomly. That's changed because the science has changed. And for example, out of the last 12 now peer-reviewed articles on the subject of Bitcoin and energy, 11 of them cite positive environmental externalities. That was not the case 3 years ago. So that's been a significant shift. The other thing that's occurred has been the first generation of research on Bitcoin has been largely debunked because of a couple of key fundamental problems that a lot of it stemmed from, namely the misapprehension, or the misunderstanding rather, that Bitcoin's energy use came from its transactions, which it doesn't. It comes from mining Bitcoin, and this created the fear that as Bitcoin's transaction volume increased, then emissions would exponentially increase, whereas we now have very good data that shows over the last 4-year halving cycle of Bitcoin that hash rate has gone up. That's the combined computational power of the Bitcoin network has increased 8-fold, 8 times more. Price has gone up more than 6 times, and yet emissions has remained static. So we have that data now. We didn't have that data 4 years ago. The other entity that I really want to highlight is the Digital Assets Research Institute, who's done a phenomenal job in compiling some of this, both the scientific literature. So there's a website that anyone can go to who can find all of these different peer-reviewed articles on the positive externalities of Bitcoin. And if they don't want to read the background science, there's also 5 white papers by, again, independent entities. So including KPMG and other reputable organizations who have come out in favor strongly of saying, yes, Bitcoin does have a very strong ESG case because it can help stabilize the grid. It can help to decarbonize the grid as a flexible user of energy, and it can help to mitigate methane. And these claims seem extraordinary, but you see that, and so much so that there's even a fear, the fear that I had, which is, well, that sounds too good to be true. It must be greenwash. But then you start to look into the nuances of how Bitcoin mining is very unique because of its location agnostic, time of day agnostic features. And you see very quickly that whilst there are other technologies around that could perform some of the functions, they cannot do it profitably like Bitcoin mining can. And because of that, it can decarbonize grids and mitigate methane in areas where other technologies cannot do it profitably. And this is now, again, it's something that Bitcoin mining companies have been saying for a long time. The difference now is, again, that the peer-reviewed research backs this up.
Amazing. And I will link to that as well, just so everyone can easily get access to it, instead of having to sift through all the noise. So coming back to the sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, do they understand Bitcoin? And do they understand the positive environmental impact of it now? Or are we still in a phase of learning and still moving the narrative? Where are we?
The really positive thing I've found with my engagement with some of these sovereign funds and also family offices is there's a lot of intellectual curiosity. So typically the starting point will be mildly negative because of what they've read, but these opinions are not hard held. They're very curious to finding out more, and they're like me. They want to do due diligence on something, and that's a positive because it means that these people are naturally skeptical. So it'll mean they're skeptical about claims it's good for the environment, but it also means they're skeptical about claims it's bad for the environment, which is positive. And that was the same mindset I had, where I decided I was going to be universally skeptical as opposed to skeptical about one side and not the other. And this is what you do. Whenever you do due diligence on a new asset or a new technology, you get different perspectives. The founder will tell you one thing and someone else will tell you another, and you put it all to one side and you do your work and you come to your own conclusions based on the data. And so that's the approach that I would just encourage any investment group or sovereign fund to go through, which is exactly what they're set up to do anyway, which is objective due diligence. So I found them very intellectually curious. And I've also found that when we provide an evidential basis for not just, so it doesn't just become a debate, well, here's what one side says and here's what another side says, but you show reasons why one set of information is based on something which is reliable and another set of information is based on something which is not reliable, such as fundamental misunderstandings about how Bitcoin transactions work, how Bitcoin works, or a fundamental lack of understanding about the nuances of energy and flexible energy use.
When you're talking with these funds, do you take them through as we started the podcast, the disruptive technologies, looking at that first? Because for me, when you gave that talk that I watched, that really put it into perspective, and it almost allows the audience to zoom out and see this has happened multiple times in history. Is that a good way of framing it? Because I'm also thinking about the audience. How do they frame it when someone comes to them with this argument?
It's a really good question. The framing is incredibly important. And the answer is yes, it is a good way to frame it. And I've learned that through experimentation. I often joke to people, I say, it took me 2 months of due diligence to work out that Bitcoin was net positive to the environment. It took me 2 years to try and explain that to other people. Why? Because it's not intuitive. And there are certain truths in life which are non-intuitive. For example, back in the day of the Copernican revolution, it was non-intuitive that the Earth revolved around the sun, because our senses appear to be telling us the sun is taking a circuit around the Earth each day. But in fact, it's a confluence of two things: the revolution of the Earth on its axis and the revolution of the Earth around the sun, not the sun around the Earth, that's causing the illusion. And we suffer a similar illusion with Bitcoin, is that because it uses a lot of energy, that must mean it's good for the environment. And it's very counterintuitive that certain types of energy consumption, yes, they are bad for the environment if they're fossil fuel based, if they're inflexible, if they have high demands about where they locate, absolutely. But if they're very flexible, if they're able to use renewable energy, if they seek out stranded energy, and if they're able to dial up and dial down the usage very fast, this has been shown to be decarbonizing to grids and the planet across multiple different metrics. So it requires a bit of intellectual curiosity. Now, the reason it's a good way to start by talking about the history of how all novel technologies are appraised is because that allows people, as you say, to see, oh, this has happened before. Because if you simply say to people, look, Bitcoin is net positive for the environment, then immediately the objection will come up, but that's not what I've read in the media. Now, people may have an element of realization that not everything they read in the media is necessarily 100% true. But to ask them to believe that a large swathe of what they've read over a number of years has all been inaccurate, that seems too much to ask for a lot of people. So it's important to say, look, the media can get it absolutely right and has got it absolutely right about a lot of things. Right? It's got it right about climate change. It's got it right about technologies after about a 15-year or 20-year period. But the media generally, and again, this is not a comment on the media today, but just the media generally throughout the last 160 years has had a consistent track record of getting it wrong for the first 15 or so, or 20 years or so, of a novel technology's existence. And we can see some really quite amusing takes about some of these technologies if we look through history. And if we look at what, for example, the radio was blamed for, anything from snowstorms to jailbreaks, to insomnia, to mental health issues, to birds dying, and then we compare and contrast it to some of the claims of what Bitcoin would do, we see there's a pattern. We see there's a pattern in the intensity of the information. We see there's a pattern in terms of the orientation of the information. And we see a pattern in terms of the prevalence of the information that rises at peaks, and then after about 10 years, it starts to subside. So that framing is actually really important.
Yeah, I think that's because I always say education is key, but I believe that communication is actually more important. How do you communicate that education? And one of the things that the barriers that I find, and I know a lot of other people find, is using more energy isn't necessarily a bad thing. How do you get over this hurdle as well?
Well, I get out of it by referencing, or rather I traverse over that hurdle by sharing my experiences of being in the environmental movement. which is often the environmental movement is mischaracterized as a movement which wants degrowth. In other words, wants to use less of everything, less energy, and wants to go backwards in history. This is not the case. There are some people within the environmental movement, absolutely, who believe we should use less resources, less energy. But that's not the majority. That's about 25%. The other 75, roughly, are people like Saul Griffiths, who will say, we actually need to use more energy, at least in the short term, because unless we use more energy, simple supply and demand economics dictate that we're not going to have a renewable transition. How are we going to get more solar or wind power onto our grids if more people aren't demanding it? Simple supply and demand economics. You don't open a bakery in a street where people are not eating bread anymore, where people are eating less bread. If they're eating more bread, then you might get another bakery. So similarly, we're not going to get another solar farm on a grid if people are needing less electricity. It just makes absolutely no sense. And we may get away with it a little while with government subsidies, but eventually the money government has will run out. They will get criticized for being white elephants, and that has happened. So we need more electricity demand, but not just any electricity demand, a certain type of electricity demand. And here there's a really important distinction, and the Bitcoin Policy Institute has been very good in helping people understand, again, this nuance. There's a great paper called The Locust and the Dung Beetle, which describes the difference between a traditional AI inference data center, so the sort of data center that will be involved where you and I do a chat GPT search, versus a Bitcoin mining data center. Now, that AI inference data center, that has to be available all the time. Because if I do a chat GPT search and I get high latency, it takes 10 seconds before I get an answer, I'm going to start getting frustrated, particularly if I want to do 13 searches in a row. So low latency is very important. That means you need to be on all the time. It means you need very high what's called availability. And that means you need to have a power source which is able to supply guaranteed power. That's not solar. That's not wind. Sun is only available at certain times of day. Wind is only available at certain times of day. If the sun goes behind a cloud or the wind stops blowing and you've got a data center running on those sources, you have a problem. Bitcoin mining, by contrast, is much more flexible because if the sun goes behind a cloud and you're hooked up to a solar farm, all you lose is that little bit of Bitcoin mining you could have done while the sun was out. You don't lose entire processes. You don't lose customers because they're getting frustrated. So it's much more forgiving. And so what that means is, and there's been some really good research done on this in a white paper a couple of years ago that showed that when you use what's called flexible load resource, that's just a fancy name for Bitcoin mining data centers in this case, then it has a decarbonizing effect on the grid because it allows the grid operator to place more variable renewable energy on the grid because that can satisfy the needs of that consumer of energy. However, when you use AI inference data centers, that forces the grid operator to put more baseload electricity on the grid. Now, that's typically going to be more thermal electricity, so it's going to be coal, and that's going to be gas. So the type of energy you're using has a pronounced impact on whether it'll be decarbonizing or carbonizing to the grid.
How unique is this for the audience? How unique is this to be able to turn on and off?
It's incredibly unique. We've never had another technology which has had the flexibility to be able to turn off and on without substantial interruption to industrial processes. When we look at and this was part of the research that it was mind-blowing to me because I looked at the claims that Bitcoin mining had this flexibility, and I found that even what the Bitcoin mining companies were saying was not strong enough in terms of its advantage. It's very unique because the ways that grid owners have used to stabilize grids in the past have been these big plants such as a steel plant or an aluminium smelter, where what happens is if you get peak demand, then the grid operator will have an arrangement with one of these steel plants or aluminium smelters to dial down their energy so that the grid doesn't crash, so they can match supply and demand. The other opportunity they have is they have what's called a gas peaker plant, so that if demand starts to spike and there's not enough energy on the grid, rather than dialing down usage, they can dial up the supply of electricity. And they do that by firing up these gas peaker plants. The problem with gas peaker plants is it means that every time you put more variable renewable energy on the grid, you also need to have more gas peaker plants as backup. So you're not truly decarbonizing your grid. And these peaker plants have to be running, they have to be idling all through the year, releasing carbon dioxide into the air for those few hours of the year, generally less than 10% of the year, where they're required to supply energy to the grid in times of peak demand. Now, if you look at the other solution, which is the steel plants or aluminium smelters, they do their job to an extent because they can dial down usage. But there's a problem. They can only dial it down for around 4 hours because after a while, there's key industrial processes that start to break down. Steel starts to harden, for example. The other thing is they have to go through a very rigorous process before they can shut down. That can take half an hour, so it's not very responsive. It doesn't have a lot of longevity. Whereas Bitcoin mining companies, they can dial down instantaneously. Within seconds, they can meet that request from the grid operator to help to stabilize the grid. And the second thing is they can shut down for not just 4 hours, but 40 hours. They can shut down for days if required. So if there's an ice storm and everyone's wrapped up their heating, or if there's a heat wave and everyone's wrapped up their cooling, they can meet that demand in a very flexible way and over a very long period of time. We have never had that sort of resource to the grid operator before. So that has a tremendously stabilizing impact on the grid. It means that grid operators don't have to invest in more gas peaker plants as they put more renewable energy onto the grid. And it also means they can build their grid out in ways which invite more variable renewable energy into the grid. Now you can say, well, that sounds good in theory, but has it happened in reality? And the answer is it absolutely not only has it, but it is happening, and it has happened over 3 years. If you look at Texas, for example, we have a really built case study, and a lot of the peer-reviewed literature is coming directly out of Texas because in 2021, suddenly we had an influx of Bitcoin mining companies. And so we now have this 3 years of data that we can collect on what that's enabled the Texas grid to do. And it's enabled two things. Number one is we've had this flywheel effect where, because Bitcoin mining companies are using a lot of the otherwise wasted renewable energy from solar operators or wind operators, that's providing more revenue to the solar or wind farm. And what does that solar or wind farm do with that revenue? They do what any prudent business operator does. They expand their business operation, which means you get more solar and more wind that's been enabled by having a customer of that stranded energy that otherwise would have been wasted because it was produced either in the middle of the day, in the case of solar, where other people didn't want it or couldn't use it, or it's produced in the middle of the night, which is often the case for wind, at a time again where a lot of people didn't need it, or there was a lot of it, but it couldn't be transported effectively through the grid because there was only so much transmission capacity. And so having an on-site Bitcoin mining company could again soak up that energy. So that's one way in which it's we have evidence now of how Bitcoin mining has really helped that renewable transition. And the other way we have evidence is that back in 2021, Berkshire Hathaway, or Hathaway Energy, in fact, was proposing a number of gas peaker plants. This was in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, when the grid did crash and billions of dollars of value was lost. And in fact, lives were lost, and the grid operator also lost his job. And so there were two causes for that. One was the equipment needed to be better weatherized to withstand ice storms and peak extreme weather events. But the second was to sort out the supply and demand issue, so you had more flexibility. And what the incoming grid operator did, he weatherized the grid, and then he said, well, how do we meet this issue of supply and demand? And suddenly you get a peak demand. What do? Do we take new gas peaker plants on? He looked at the proposal. He looked at the alternative, which is this new thing called Bitcoin mining. He knew nothing about it, wasn't a Bitcoiner. He's from the utility industry. But he realized, and this is Brad Jones, the former CEO of ERCOT, realized that that could actually do the job that he was previously would have had to have used a gas peaker plant to do. So rather than buying, and it would have cost upwards of $8 billion these expensive and fossil fuel-based gas peaker plants to create more supply, he could utilize Bitcoin mining companies to decrease demand at times when there was peak electricity. And this scrambles people's brains, because people say, well, how is that possible? Because surely they raise supply, they're using more electricity, and then they're just dialing it down. So aren't we just getting back to where we were? And that's a good question to ask. And I was skeptical about that as well. But that doesn't take into account the fact that it's because of Bitcoin mining companies that we have more renewable energy on the grid in the first place. And when you look at those two considerations together, that's why there haven't been new blackouts on the Texas grid. That's why, despite even heavier power demand, we've had stable grids in Texas. And that's why solar and wind farms have not reached a point where that's as much as they could scale, but have continued to scale at a breakneck pace on the Texas grid, to the point where the ERCOT grid, the grid of Texas, now has more variable renewable energy on it than California does. And Bitcoin mining has not been the only factor there, but it has been one of the supporting factors that's allowed that proliferation by, again, creating that flywheel where it created a customer for that energy that otherwise would have been wasted, that was placed back into expanding the operation.
Wow. It is incredible what they're doing over there. Are other people looking to this that you know of, looking to this, and is game theory going to come into this as well? Because you said is it 3 years of data we've got now from ERCOT? Surely grids around the world are looking to this and seeing the advantage.
They already have. So this is happening. There's a electricity generation company in New Zealand right now that uses Bitcoin a very similar way with hydro. There's ones in Canada that use it in a very similar way. There's ones in South America that are using it in a similar way. Again, to monetize otherwise wasted energy, there's the major utility company in Japan has just investigated at a pilot level, has been watching what's been happening in Texas and other parts of the world, is going, hey, by our calculations, we've got $1 million of wasted renewable energy every single year that could easily be monetized simply by having Bitcoin mining in operation. They've done the math on it, and they've worked out this makes economic sense, but it also makes environmental sense. And we can use that increased resources, that increased profitability, and again, do the same thing that ERCOT has done, to reinvest that into expanding our renewable and our solar operations. So very much so, the world is watching and is copying. It doesn't tend to be publicized for a range of different reasons very much. So you have to kind of go looking to hear these case studies, but it's happening more and more. It's already happening in around 5 grids that I know of personally in the world, but there's also a number who are now investigating. So just as more and more pension funds are now looking to say, okay, one has done it, let's look at this. There are quite a significant number of grids around the world, including in India, who are now looking to see how they can utilize Bitcoin in the same way to meet their own renewable energy transformation or transition targets.
So good to see this happening and the narrative changing as this blocker of the environmental impact narrative is slowly debunked. Do you think we're just pulling this into the media conversation that we had? Do you think we're over this, or where do you think we are in that? I think you said 10-year period of a lot of negativity. Do you think we're coming out the other side of it, or there?
So I drew a graph when it kind of started here, and really the energy narrative against Bitcoin started in force in 2018. So it started quite a long time after Bitcoin. There were other narratives that were used against Bitcoin, which have mostly and largely been debunked now. But the one that's been the most pervasive lately has been the energy one. It started around 2018, and then it peaked in 2022, and now we're about here. We've actually got some very good data which charts the amount of positive, negative, and neutral coverage on Bitcoin generally, but also the specific Bitcoin and energy question. So it's going downwards, it's trending down. There's still a bit that occurs from time to time. But what we're also seeing is that there are more and more positive articles about Bitcoin and energy, positive articles about Bitcoin and the environment in magazines and newspapers such as Forbes magazine, in the Financial Times, even in Bloomberg. So this is becoming more prevalent again. So we are not quite there yet, but we're trending in the right direction. We're trending towards greater understanding.
And hopefully it will end up in a tick box for ESG for a lot of institutions that have that mandate. So what I'm going to do is, I was speaking to you before we started recording. I'm going to link to just a document, and I'll chat with you after, and we'll just put some good reports and articles, places to look to find this information, so people don't have to go out searching for it. I would like a place where people could just come and have it all there to actually sift through, because if we tried to go through it in one podcast, it might be quite a few hours. Yeah. And I want to stay away from that. So that wraps up everything. And thank you so much for coming on and talking about this, because it is a big blocker for a lot of people. And
appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And if anyone wants to get in contact with you, what is the best way to do that?
They can get in contact. One way is through X/Twitter. My handle is @DSBatten. The other way is through CH4 Capital, and that's the climate tech fund that I run, where we've actually started to use Bitcoin mining specifically to look at something we didn't talk about today, which is methane mitigation. So CH4 Capital, if they want to find out more about what we're doing on the methane mitigation side.
Awesome. And I will link to everything that we've talked about in the show notes, so it's easy for people to find. Again, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.